Am I on? Am I on? All right.
Yes, you are.
All right. I'm not seeing it on my other computer here. Go.
Yes, Jacques, go ahead.
All right. I apologize, everyone, if you've been looking at me being a boob. Hello, my name is Jacques Lamar, and as you can see, I am not your usual host and not competent like your usual host, Jennifer LaRue, who is tonight at the hospital awaiting the birth of her first grandchild. So I am her incompetent replacement, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to this evening's discussion for the Mark Twain House and Museum. First, I want to thank our sponsors, the Wish You Well Foundation, our media sponsor, WNPR, and say that this entire series of virtual author programs has been produced in part with support honoring the memory of Frank Lord, who was a dear board member and friend of the Mark Twain House and Museum. A few quick things before we get underway and introduce our guests. The first is the most important. We are discussing this wonderful book that you're about to hear, WILDLAND, The Making of America's Fury by Evan Osnos. If you came here for a different book, you are in the wrong Zoom box. This book is available through our store, and we know that you can buy it elsewhere. You know that you could maybe find it cheaper. You may be able to read it on a Kindle or Audible or take it out of the library. But when you buy it from us, you support the Mark Twain House and Museum. And so you're not only supporting the author and his wonderful journalism, but also the museum. So in the chat field, you will see a link to our online bookstore where you'll be able to not only purchase the book, but that you'll get it signed by Evan Osnos. So please consider being generous that way. Another way you can be generous is by clicking on the green bar below my face. And that allows you to make a direct donation to the Mark Twain House and Museum. It is no surprise that this last year and a half has been difficult for everybody, Mark Twain House included. So if you would like to help support the museum in another way, please consider clicking that green bar and making a generous gift to the museum, or a not so generous gift, but a gift. You will also notice at the bottom of the screen a little thing that says ask a question. This is where you can ask a question, not of me, but of our guest author or moderator. So if you have a burning question that comes up that you would like answered during the course of the program, instead of putting it in the chat where it may get lost, please put it in the Ask a Question feature. And late in the program, Susan's going to invite me back up, and we will have a Q&A with Susan and Evan. So please take advantage of the Ask a Question feature. Lastly, in regards to this, if you have jumped in late, your computer freezes up, you can't watch through the end of the program, this program will be available for you to replay and watch again ad nauseum after the program is completed. So you can use the same link to go back to it. You can use it to share it with friends. So please know that this will be available, and we'll also post it on our digital offerings portion of our website. So on to more fun things. I want to introduce first our moderator. Susan Campbell is an amazing friend of the Mark Twain House and Museum. She, like Mark Twain, is from Missouri and somehow became a Connecticut Yankee like Mark Twain. She is a columnist for the Hearst, Connecticut newspaper group. She is a former columnist for, as she refers to it, Mother Current, where she was also the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize. And she is the author of her memoir, Dating Jesus. She's written Tempest Tossed, a biography of Isabella Beecher Hooker, and her latest work of nonfiction is Frog Hollow, Stories from an American Neighborhood. Our author this evening, as mentioned, Evan Osnos, is no slouch himself. He was a staff writer at The New Yorker, a CNN contributor, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and his first book, Age of Ambition, won the 2014 National Book Award and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. And as the Beijing bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune, he was part of a team that won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, making me the only person on screen tonight not to have won a Pulitzer Prize. So again, please enjoy this conversation, and I will be back to help with your questions that you will put in that Ask a Question feature. Susan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Shock. I appreciate it. Before we start talking about this wonderful book, which has consumed my life for the last month or so, Evan, you have a personal connection to the Mark Twain House. Would you like to
I do. I have to say it's fun to be doing this event. I only wish I was there in human form. But I should say, I have had this interest in Mark Twain for a long time, going back to when I was living in China, and I got interested in the way that Twain wrote about the Gilded Age, and it helped me understand actually China today. And so when we moved back to the United States, Sarah Beth and I, now my wife, we were home on a vacation at one point before moving back, and I said, we have to go visit the Mark Twain House in Hartford. And she said, okay. And I knew at that point it was true love and that we would be together forever and ever. And, we did it. We toured around and she marveled at it the same way I did. So I think it was a sign of a match made in heaven.
Are you making that up? Is that a real story?
That is a real thing. We actually were there running in a race. I'm a terrible, extremely slow runner. And we were running in a race in Hartford and we said, we're going to go to the Twain House. And so we did the two of them. The race was for her and the Twain House was for me. So that's how it happens.
I hope she can hear this. Make her watch this because that declaration of love was kind of awesome.
Yeah, it's true. It'll be on YouTube forever. She'll see.
There you go. I want you to talk a little bit about the impetus of this book. I was fascinated by what made you've lived elsewhere, which I'm sure gives you a unique perspective on this country. And then you came back, and was it because you found things so changed you returned? Was it 2013?
Yeah, I came back in 2013, exactly. And I have to say, when I came back, I did not initially expect that I was going to be writing a book of this kind, meeting an attempt to try to reckon with the country and where we are as a political culture, more than just our politics. But I really did come back and have this feeling of being unfamiliar. It didn't feel like I recognized the political moment. I mean, I'll just give you one sort of precipitating incident, which was, it's relevant to today's events, in fact, because on the day I started work in Washington, I realized, looking at the calendar, it was 8 years ago tomorrow. It was October 1st of 2013. And the government shut down that day. And it shut down. It was the first time in 17 years. We seem to have just averted a similar repeat this time. But when it shut down that day, it hadn't happened in a long time. It had been, since the Clinton administration. And it was a strange kind of self-imposed act of almost sort of political self-immolation. The idea that we would shut down our own government. And I wandered around Washington. It was a very odd first day. And I went up to Capitol Hill and I ended up meeting these tourists. They were from Finland and they were very polite. And they said to me, does this happen very often that your government shuts down? And I sort of had to say, well, not all the time, but and they said, well, when will it reopen? And I said, I don't actually know. None of us know, actually, because we're sort of captive to this strange, remember, it was a sort of the minority of a minority of a minority within Congress that was responsible. And that was one of those moments where I thought to myself, how did we get into a situation in which this was happening? I mean, at the time, there was a Republican congressman who described his colleagues, the ones who were responsible for the shutdown, he called them lemmings with suicide vests. And I thought, now, how did we get into a moment like this, where we are captive to the lemmings with suicide vests? And there might be some writing to be done. And so that was the sensation that started this thing.
We seem so naive looking back at
I know.
A government shutdown was an eye-opener. I should have asked you this. How long had you been living elsewhere outside the country before
I've been abroad for a decade, basically 11 years. I went overseas in 2002.
And you were in the Middle East and China during that time?
Yeah, I was a newspaper reporter. I worked at the Chicago Tribune, and I went first to the Middle East and worked in Iraq and Egypt and traveled around the region writing about Syria and Iran and so on. But I really always wanted to go to China. I'd studied Chinese for a long time, going back to college. I'd been there studying on a couple of occasions and had always wanted to go to China and be a correspondent. So then when I went, and I think probably part of the appeal was the vastness of it. It felt in its own strange way like it was American in its scale and complexity and sort of almost kind of implausible complexity when a country of that size. And so I spent 8 years in China and wrote a book about it, and then came back to the United States. And there is this tradition, I mean, that was sort of relevant to my mind, Susan, which was that, you know, there is this old tradition of people coming back from abroad and trying to, and sort of using that moment as a little bit of a clarifying moment, because your senses are awakened when you come home to a place that you know, and you sort of notice things. You notice the roof tiles that have slipped, and you notice the garden is overgrown. And in this case, you notice that something named Ted Cruz has grown in the garden. But I mean, in my case, there was just this cascade of sort of moments of awareness. And I wanted to try to record that while the sensations were fresh. So that was how it started.
In the book, you focus on 3 places, places that you're familiar with, either from having lived there, worked there, grown up there. And as I was reading it, first of all, the detail in the reporting made me think there's no place I know as well as you appear to know Greenwich, Chicago, and West Virginia. But could you have taken any 3 other places without that personal understanding of the sites and still written this book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because no is the answer. And I say this partly with awareness of the tools that we have as journalists. I mean, you and I have both gone to places that we don't know over the years, and part of the job is to try to encapsulate what's happening there. And we can make a pretty good effort of it. You talk to a bunch of folks in town, and I will do this again. It's part of the work. But this required something different. This project felt like it was, because I was trying to get to the core of America's political crisis, it felt more personal. And I felt like I had to be able to go to places where I could have a more personal conversation, because really the story of how we got into this period of fury, as I call it, is ultimately an assemblage of a mountain of private moments. We see it, we experience it through public life, but it is these decisions that people are making around things like how they imagine their relationship to the government, and their relationship to their neighbors, and their relationship to the land beneath their feet. And all of those kinds of things are very hard to get on first encounter. And I realized if I went to places I know, 3 places I've lived, then I can actually measure what's changed over time. You know, what have we gained and what have we lost? And I could skip some of the sort of front page kind of political conversation. I didn't really care, frankly, about, you know, whether somebody liked this candidate or that candidate. I wanted to understand the why. And I could only do that if I had some claim to the place. And so that's how I came to these three very, very different places. And they provide very different perspectives on the country.
They really do. That almost gave you an in, though. I'm thinking of West Virginia in particular, where you can helicopter in and say, I'm with CNN, I'm with New Yorker, and that's not going to open a door.
Yeah, I mean, I do have in fact, one West Virginia reporter who I was talking to in the course of working on the book, she remembers this experience of, there was a terrible mine disaster, and she was covering it for the AP. And she walked around a corner, and the sort of national press had descended on this mine. And she walked around a corner and almost bumped into Nancy Grace. And there's nothing against Nancy Grace, but this reporter friend of mine, she said, "What are you doing?" I mean, she was thinking to herself, "What are you doing here? You don't have a right to be here," in the sense to sort of participate in this period of immense tragedy and to try to make sense of it in any kind of deep way. And I'm very self-conscious in some ways about ever trying to write about a place, because it's hard. I mean, as you know, when you write about a place, you really got to try to get it right, because if it feels off, then it makes people doubt the portraiture if the people themselves don't feel that. So in the case of West Virginia, my experience of it goes back a ways to when I first got out of college. I graduated from school. Before I graduated, I was very interested in trying to find a job as a photographer at a small newspaper. And I applied to a bunch of places everywhere, basically between Mobile, Alabama and Homer, Alaska. And the folks in Homer actually replied in an interesting way. They said, well, I mean, the problem is we're only going to have about 4 hours of daylight in the winter months, so we don't really need that many photographers, but thanks. But so anyway, the Clarksburg, West Virginia newspaper called the Clarksburg Exponent Telegram said, yeah, you can come down and you can be a photographer. You'll be an intern. And so I packed up right away and drove down there and started work. And I just loved it. I fell in love with the place because there is something about Appalachia that gets under your skin. I mean, as a writer and also just as an American, there's something that is very deeply embedded in our understanding of the country. That's a very bland way of putting it, but it is this collision of all of these different cultures and problems and strengths and weaknesses. I mean, it's coal country, but it's also beautiful country. And it's also a place that has been in the crosshairs of all of this political fighting. And one of the things I came to want to write about in the book was the way in which it has been sort of a pawn in our politics in a fascinating way.
And this now makes you the expert on Joe Manchin. And I listened to you on Fresh Air when Terry Gross was asking you so much about Joe Manchin, whom you've met, whom you've written about, whom you've followed around, and who today was back in the news with.
He is.
Can you sum him up for us? And then I want to go back to the book. And you can do it in a limerick or a song, however.
Exactly. Well, how would Twain do it? He would have a better way of doing it. But, you know, in some ways, so Manchin is, at one point I described Manchin in the New Yorker as physically, at least, feeling he has the physical presence of a sort of high-priced college football coach. And I got a lot of notes about that. People said, yes, that's correct. That's exactly what he's like. And it is true. And that actually is meaningful in the sense that he sits at this very sort of strange combination of experiences in West Virginia. He's a big deal. I mean, he's been a big deal since he was 17 or 18 years old, because he was a high school and then eventually a college football star. And the reason I mention that, it's not an incidental fact, because that actually shapes some of his conduct politically. He is, I would say, obsessed with and addicted to being at the center of attention. And you can see it when you turn on the TV at any hour of the day. There he is with a scrum of reporters. And the reason why that matters is because he was never, whatever he is going to do over the course of the next, 24, 48, 96 hours, which are consequential for the fate of the Republic, he was never going to do that without all of this preamble, all of this kind of courtship from the president, all of this attention from the press. That's part of his process. The crazy thing I will say is, I don't think that we know exactly what he's going to do, because I don't think he knows exactly what he's going to do. I think he has a general idea. I know.
Oh my God. I was hoping he knows he's going to spring it on us and we'll be offended or happy, but okay.
He's more improvisational than that. And I think, and the thing is, he is, as you can guess, a completely maddening figure for Joe Biden, because he is, he and Kirsten Sinema are the people standing in the way. And yet at the same time, Biden on some level kind of speaks fluent Manchin, because not only are they two Catholic Joes in their 70s, but also they're these guys who believe in the idea of persuadable politicians. And that may be a fantasy, but they both participate in that idea. They both believe in that. And so these kind of, I think there is, Jacques is the playwright in this group, and he might need to write a play about Joe Manchin and Joe Biden, because that dynamic of these two, I mean, it's like, if you think Frost Nixon is interesting, if you think any of these kinds of dynamics are interesting, these two have turned out to be at the center of this moment of our politics in a way that I think is alarming to a lot of folks.
That was better than a limerick.
I can't do limericks. I would have if I could have.
Probably for the best, actually. But there's a portion of your book that there were a lot of moments where I thought, God damn, that's good. But one part that really leapt out to me was you were writing about community versus individualism.
Yeah.
And the idea of we're all in this together versus I got mine. And that's a gross paraphrasing of what you said. At what point in your research did that start to crop up? The idea, the different approaches to us as a society, whether it's for myself or for my neighbors.
Yeah, it's like in some ways it's sort of the central nerve, I think, that runs through a lot of my thinking. And as you say, I don't sort of always announce it, but you're so right to pick up on that as being the kind of the axle around which a lot of this is turning. And it actually goes back to my experience in China that made me pay attention to this, because China is at a very different moment, obviously a completely different set of circumstances, but it is also tugged between these two instincts towards the individual and towards the collective. And in China's experience, after all, they're coming out of this period of the 1960s and 70s when the collective impulse was disastrous for them. That was sort of taken to its logical extreme. That was all the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution. And they sort of tacked in the other direction. And what the period that I was living in China and writing about it, and much of the content of Age of Ambition is about documenting the rise of this notion of the individual there and what all of the forces that kind of unleashed. And then I came back to the United States and discovered that actually this tension, which goes all the way back to the beginning of our political identity between the collective and the individual, and that sort of that delicate balance had, to my mind, drifted wildly out of whack to the point that we were celebrating the right of the individual, the liberty of the individual, to the detriment of the group. And I think all of us can think of very contemporary examples of how that is playing out. But to my mind, there's a nice way of framing it, actually, that Robert Putnam at Harvard, who has written so well about essentially the sort of architecture of our society and our culture. He's the one who gave us Bowling Alone. And then he and his co-author, whose name is Shailin Romney Garrett, they came up with this elegant way of describing it, which was that in the sort of history of America's idea of itself, we're torn between the individual horse rider on the hill, that kind of Marlboro Man mythology, and then the fuller facts, the fuller truth, which is that there was a wagon train that was also keeping that Marlboro Man alive. And the wagon train, not incidentally, had women and children in it who don't always appear in that first part of the narrative. But it was these two instincts between the sort of celebrating the lone individualist on the hill versus acknowledging that without mutualism, without some sense of our commitment to one another, our interdependence, without somebody to stitch up that Marlboro Man when he tumbles off his horse, then we're doomed. And in a way, I came to feel as if we had lost some sense of that faith in ourselves as a society of people who help one another, in addition to valorizing the ones who get to the top of the heap. And it became very visible to me in very real terms. And look, I saw it in Greenwich. I mean, I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, not too far from, just down the highway, essentially, from the Twain House. And I was very aware of the degree to which those two ideas had been in tension with one another all the way back to the Puritans. That, you were, on the one hand, you would celebrate the individual for seeking to distinguish his or herself. On the other hand, you wouldn't try to do too much of it, and you wouldn't offend God in the classic sense. And I was struck by the way in which it felt to me as if we'd lost our bearings on that score.
The stories about the hedge fund people in Greenwich, I found that is a world I'm aware exists, but those big walls you talked about, I don't go behind them. That was fascinating to me to read about how people talk among themselves in Greenwich, kind of out of both sides of their mouths, not all of them, that, wow, this is weird, but this is our culture and we made it. We're at the top.
And I think it could apply, there are sort of, what I was capturing there was the feeling of how, on some level, I think all of us are aware that the period of the last 20 years, and more broadly, the last 40 years, in which you have seen the rapid accumulation of wealth, particularly at the very top, has had an impact on our overall functioning as a society. And what's interesting, Susan, when I started on this 6 years ago, that wasn't yet even really fully acknowledged to the degree that we talk about it now. And I remember walking around at the beginning of the project and sort of slightly mumbling into my collar about how I'm really writing partly about the effect of the wealth gap and what that's doing to credibility of capitalism, credibility of government, credibility of our institutions, and ultimately faith in the American political commons. Because that felt like I was sort of, I don't know, I thought maybe I'm being alarmist. And then a lot happened over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. And that's no longer kind of felt as to be an outlier thing to say. In fact, one of the things I describe in the book is that some people who are some of America's most successful capitalists would say, yes, our system we've lost any reasonable precedent in the history of American inequality. We've entered a zone that is beyond anything recognizable and is totally unsustainable. But nobody was kind of talking quite that way. Very few people were talking about it.
The Occupy movement might have been the rest of us. We were covering that as a protest, not as a widespread protest.
And it's interesting. I mean, the Occupy was sort of a preview of what was to come. I don't even think we fully appreciated it at the time, because that was 2011, and it took a few years before that began to fully manifest.
And then we come to the symptom that we elected as, not we, people elected as president. And I loved how you characterized, I'd forgotten some of these things, and I can't believe I forgot them because I was on Twitter the whole time. But you document some of these situations with the former president and acknowledge that he was not the issue. He was the result of this separating ourselves from the collective attitude of rampant capitalism, where, accumulate as much and as quickly as you can by appealing to the very people who were hurt most by both of those movements.
Yeah. And I had some pretty fascinating conversations in West Virginia with people who voted for Trump. And I said, honestly, when you cast that vote, I'm thinking of one person in particular, a coal miner named David Efaw, who I quote in WILDLAND. And he's very thoughtful about his political choices. And I said, did you believe that what Trump was telling you? Honestly, did you believe that he was going to revive the coal industry, which is, for all kinds of structural reasons in decline? And he said, well, no, I didn't believe everything he said. He said, but he was listening to me. He was paying attention to us. He was coming here and paying attention to us. And I thought that's actually an underappreciated element in our politics. Is you almost have to call it sort of the body language of politics, because it's not that, I think on any sort of policy level, if you lined up the programs that he was proposing versus what Democrats have been proposing to try to transition to a world beyond coal and a more sustainable economy for West Virginia, it's not as if what he was offering was going to succeed. In fact, West Virginia ended up losing more coal jobs over the course of the next 4 years than it had at the beginning. But as he said to me, he said, I felt as if he was listening to me. And there's kind of a fascinating bit of history that's worth mentioning just in 20 seconds, which is Clarksburg, West Virginia was really important on the map of Democratic Party politics for a long time. In 1960, to give you one example, John F. Kennedy came to town, Jackie Kennedy came to town, Bobby Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson. And amazingly, Jack Kennedy even got up on local television for a half an hour and answered questions from people. And I and I talked to folks at the Historical Society in Clarksburg. I said, well, what other presidential candidates have come to town since then? And they said, well, we've looked back through the records and it looks like Jesse Jackson came once in 1988, but that's it. And so there is this feeling as if people feel as if they fell off the radar screen. And you see that reflected in part of the political transformation of West Virginia, that it went from being all Democrats, more or less, certainly was when I was there in 1999 as a young journalist, to today being, of course, very Republican, very red territory.
Your book is bookended by the 2001 terrorist attacks through the January 6th insurrection. Was that a conscious effort? Is that an epoch to you? Like that's a definable era that made sense to end at January 6th, but start at 2001?
I knew I was starting on 2001 because for me, that really was sort of zero day for a lot of the sensibilities that I think have governed our politics in this period, the politics of fear and the opportunistic use of fear, which is a huge piece of this kind of the escalating story that I tell over the course of the book, is ways in which people were finding, particularly political opportunists, were finding ways to latch onto that current of fear. But I had no sense that January 6th was coming. But of course, what I had a sense was that we were reaching this point of ignition, of kind of impossible tension. And I was on January 6th as a reporter for the New Yorker. I went to the Capitol when this all was kicking off. And I was kind of standing there realizing at that moment, I was deep in the book. I was actually on book leave from the magazine. And my friend, an editor, had called me a couple of days earlier and he said, hey, it looks like this thing on January 6th might be sort of rough. Would you be willing to kind of go down there if it happens? More or less because I've been a foreign correspondent. I mean, he and I know each other from being overseas. And I said, yeah, I mean, I'll go down. I don't know if it'll be anything at all, but I think, yeah.
That's so that, like an editor, there could be gunfire. Can you go cover it?
Yes, exactly. And he said, send us your cab receipts. And I did. I mean, I was standing there on that very bleak day and I was realizing, yeah, this is actually a kind of haunting end note to what had been this process that began 20 years earlier, by which I meant a sort of a shock to our national psyche, a shock to our image of ourselves, and a realization that we were actually living in a world that was not quite what we thought we were. I think that's part of why it felt like such a natural bookend.
Okay.
And this book, as you know, Susan, and I am so grateful for your close reading of it, that it is like, this was a period that I was sort of documenting this almost like it felt to me like documenting my adult life. I mean, I was 24 years old, when 9/11 happened. I was a reporter and it more or less defined the course of the places I went and the work that I did in the years afterwards. And it's not sort of an extravagant connection to say that everything was leading up to that moment, that January 6th was in so many ways the culmination of all of these threads.
That I was going to say two things about that. One, this is weirdly a personal journey, yours, although you're not in this, not per se. It's not.
Right.
And then I went here, and then I thought this. And the other thing is that at first I thought this question would be impossible to answer. Was January 6th inevitable?
Yes, I think something like it was, because it was this inferno of lies and cynicism and everything that had been building for years in our politics, kind of unacknowledged or at least unpunished, that people had just been constantly deceiving their voters. I mean, just to take one example, for years, you heard leaders of the Republican Party telling their voters, we are going to get Obamacare rescinded and replaced. And it was actually an act of legal deception. They were pretending as if this was actually going to happen in some sort of easy way. And I tell this one moment in the book when Mitch McConnell just stated the numerical fact that he didn't have the votes to do it, and was then sort of pilloried by some of his base because they said, how could you say such a thing? You're giving up the fight. And he had to engage in this ridiculous theater of saying, well, no, I'm not giving up the fight. I was just, had a brief moment of, I don't know what you would call it, reality. But so for years, there had been this kind of acculturating people to the idea of fantastical, magical political thinking. And so, what really struck me, Susan, was on that day, on January 6th, the number of people who I met who said to me, this is my first trip to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And I thought, my God, they think this is like a foreign, it feels to them, they are so attenuated from the politics and they feel so alienated from it, that they are finding themselves summoned here on essentially a sort of mystical, on a fantasy, and that was disturbing. Here we are now 9 months later, and it has not gone away. Obviously, it has gotten worse, and yet I will say, and this is not just sort of cheap optimism, because I think, as you know from reading the book, I don't kind of go in for that. But what I do believe is that one of the ways that we begin to address problems of this kind is by writing about them, is by documenting them, and by putting them before us and say, hey, look at this. We made this. We made this political culture, and we can unmake it. And that's actually one of the first steps, I think, in beginning to address the source of these problems.
Is to acknowledge what happened. Firm but fair about it.
Yeah.
But if you have a contingent of people who disagree with acknowledging what happened,
yeah,
where do you go from there?
I don't think it relieves you of either the need or the responsibility to do it. In fact, I've been thinking about the fact that even though you have members of Congress who have resisted the idea of a really robust examination of January 6th, obviously the commission never happened. So you're getting this more kind of anemic process now. That actually means that all of the other forms of documentation, of the kinds that we can do as independent observers, as writers, as citizens, as journalists, takes on all that much more meaning, because we don't have a 9/11 commission report. I have to say, though, sort of to your deeper question, to your broader question of, well, what do we do about this crisis of fact, that we have a portion of the American public who is sort of recusing themselves from the Enlightenment right now? I have to say, I think that one of the things that I come back to is the power of local institutions, local news, to give you one example. I mean, I am a big believer in the idea that having a robust local newspaper is not just about covering the local government. It's also about reminding people about their connections to one another on a level beneath and beyond just their political identity. It's one thing to say, okay, my neighbor is a Trump guy or a Biden guy. It's another thing to say, and I have these 10 other ways in which we are connected to one another, because we are parents in the school system, and we are people who are trying to solve lead in the water. There are all these ways that you connect to one another. I obviously, my biases are showing. I chose the newspaper as an example of investing in local culture, but I think it applies to a lot of other institutions. And the reason why I mention it is one of the phenomena I describe in the book is the nationalization of our political culture. Part of the reason why this has happened is because people feel less and less connected to their local communities. And the data is striking. I mean, over the last half century, Americans have become less good about naming the governors of their own states. And at the same time, though, we haven't lost any ability to name the vice president or the president. So there is this strange effect. And I think one of the ways you begin to restore some of that belief in institutions, we see it in the data. People actually believe their local newspapers more than they believe national media. And that's fine with me. But in order for that to work, we have to support local institutions. And, I should announce my priors here, which is my wife works for an organization that is involved in cultivating nonprofit local news organizations, because that may be part of the future.
That's awesome. I just have one more question, and then maybe we have questions. I see Jacques is lurking around, and maybe he can help us answer some questions. But if we restore faith in the local institutions, is that going to help us get back to the collective? You say that like I'm a Soviet Russian from the 1950s. Will that help us start thinking in terms of community as opposed to individual?
Yeah, I think that's a really important connection that you're drawing, because it is true. In a sense, what you're trying to do is remind people of the idea that we are not, all of us, isolated in our own little political silos. I mean, there was just an extraordinarily prescient description of the interaction between technology and politics. Years ago, Neil Postman, who was one of the great kind of media scholars, this is before the internet is what it is in our lives. And he said that, each new iteration of technology does create new forms of community. And we see it, it's the ability to be in a Facebook group with somebody on the other side of the country because you have some shared interest. He said, but it is a community populated by strangers that know only the most superficial facts about one another. And the antidote to that reality is actually investing in a sense of connection to the people around you. And if you are aware of your interdependence, the fact that during a pandemic, you are only as strong or as weak as your neighbors, and you are only as safe or as sick as your neighbors, those kinds of things matter. And I think the pandemic was sort of an X-ray into just how ailing that awareness of our mutualism is. I sort of I had that hope that this was going to be one of those moments that sort of summons our better angels and we suddenly reminded of it. And that's not what happened. But we're talking about it, actually. I mean, just as a literal matter, we weren't talking about things like those forms of interconnection in quite as explicit terms as we are today. So that's sort of, there's somebody in the book, one of the folks who I write about, who says, you can't fix what you can't see. And I take that point quite deeply, because I think part of this process is about us documenting what we've learned about how we got into this mess so that we can begin to fix it.
Well, I can't end on anything better than that. It is an extraordinary book. If you have not read the book yet, I can't recommend it enough. I'll probably start it and reread it. That's how much I like the book. But thank you very much. I appreciate this. And we can start. I don't have a Q&A at the bottom of my screen, but I bet Jacques does.
There is a Q&A feature, but there are no Qs yet. So I'm going to, as Jennifer says, exercise host privilege. And people in the audience may be formulating questions. Throw some softballs your way, as you were saying earlier, Susan. I think one of the, I'm in the midst of listening to Peril. I was talking about the new Bob Woodward book, and how he's able to get so many people to go kind of on the record about things. How, and this could apply to both of you, how, when there's so much mistrust of media and so much made of quote unquote fake news, how do you instill trust when you're approaching people to talk about politics? How are you able to, what was that?
I said, Susan, why don't you go first? And then
I think you're the expert at this. Believe it or not, I still love talking to people with whom I disagree and agree. So I think when I call or meet someone, I'm putting out that vibe. I really want to talk to you. I really do. And an interview is a guided conversation. And you listen in an interview the way you don't get listened to ever again. In conversations with my friends, they're talking, good, it's my turn. I didn't hear a thing they said because I can't wait to talk. An interview is the exact opposite. And that can be very attractive to people who, as Evan said, they maybe don't feel like they get listened to. I much prefer talking to people like the coal miners in West Virginia than I would Joe Manchin, who gets talked to way too much. But that's my cheap and easy answer.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I'm struck by how often I'll get a nasty email, let's say, after I publish a piece, and somebody will write in, say something really angry and say, you're a liberal media stooge. And I always reply, I'm always interested. And very often when you reply to that email, the note you get back is, hey, I'm so pleased you responded to my email. And then oftentimes you can actually end up having a conversation. I don't want to romanticize it too much. Every once in a while, somebody just says, you know, die yuppie scum or whatever it is. But like occasionally you really do have, and what it reminds me of, as Susan said, is it is one of the perverse facts of our time that in this period of connection in so many ways, people are actually crying out for a more meaningful exchange of ideas, even when they don't. You know, I'm working on a story right now where somebody who is the main subject has said to me half a dozen times, I don't trust the New Yorker magazine. I don't trust what you do. I don't trust the liberal media. And I said, so why are we having our third hour of interviews? And he says, well, because you're interested. And I'm kind of interested in talking about it. And I do think that's important. And I think, you know, there is something really durable about the simple technology of an interview, about having that exchange of experience and asking somebody. You know, I think Susan and I probably do it in a similar way. I'm really very, very, very interested in just closing my mouth and listening when I'm interviewing somebody, because you never know what's going to happen. You never know, and if you think you know going into it, you're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And as a quick follow-up, I mean, have you felt this general mistrust of the media more acutely recently? And has it created obstacles for you in your work?
Didn't you get threatened January 6th? Some
Yeah.
naughty man said naughty things to you?
Yeah. Somebody said, you know, why don't I punch you in your face? And he may have used a barnyard epithet, as we used to say in the newspaper when he described it. I mean, but you know, and there is some real menace, and I don't want to sort of be too dismissive of it because it can take on a really nasty form. I mean, in the course of writing this book, I talked to people who were in some cases threatening. However, it's the exception, not the rule. And I think I'm also, you know, there is a little bit of that experience of believing that if you really people can read you, and if they feel that you're there and you've come a long way and you've made yourself vulnerable, you've come into their domain, into their terrain, and you are there for no other reason but to try to write down how they live and how they feel about it. You'd be surprised about how often people will talk to you. Does that resonate with you, Susan? Is that how you've had it?
Very much. I don't think I've actually felt threatened but twice in 500 years in journalism. And I've had some antagonistic interviews, people who didn't want me in their office. And it's as you said, I won't say I come in peace, but I don't come for war. I'm strictly there to gather information, and I'd love to hear your side. And okay, you don't want to give me your side. Here's my card. I hope you call. Yeah, but I think you're right. You don't want to belittle, because I think there are some journalists who really are getting threatened, and they're serious threats. I'm not one of them, but I respect that they're still doing the job.
I mean, in its own way, there was actually sort of there was a very hostile experience that I had after writing about Trump's support among white nationalists, and I don't go into a lot of detail in the book, but they all kinds of really sort of nasty stuff that I was sort of directed my way, and you know, in its own strange way, it was useful for me to know that there is that much of a community of people who were that active and that attentive to what was being written. That was, in its own way, that became another morsel of information that helped me understand just how serious our political situation was.
Do you mind if
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
Moderator, I'm privileged because this book is so dense and so thick. Was there at any point where you were, how to ask this, did you write the book you thought you were going to write? Or did you have to change what you were doing at some point because January 6th or something else?
No, I mean, there was a point along the way where I sort of said to my to my wife at one point. I was like, "How did you let me embark on 3 books in one?" Because it's 3 essentially, they're interwoven, but it is trying to be 3 fully realized representations of 3 places in America. And one is tempted after a book like this to say, for my next book, I'm writing about a catcher for the Mets, like one person, and that's it. But no, I mean, we sort of, my publisher and I jokingly called it it's a whole enchilada book, meaning I tried to write about this thing of ours, this republic, which sounds ludicrously sort of pompous when you describe it that way, except that was the only thing I knew how to take on, because I was coming back and I had to try to wrap my eye. This was this was therapy in the form of writing. I was trying to reckon with how the country had become so, the word I came to was furious, but the actual turns of the course of the river along the way, the fact that there was no Me Too when I began, there was no Black Lives Matter movement. It hadn't even really begun. And there was certainly no pandemic. And yet in their own way, I mean, and I hope this comes through in the writing, one begins to feel as if they are almost inevitable outgrowths of the preconditions that were coming before them. And that's how it felt as a writer. And I had some brilliant editing along the way. The most important editing that I got was somebody saying, just keep going, just keep going. I mean, as you know, as a writer, at some points you need somebody to say, just keep going.
Did you ever hate the book? And then I'll stop. I'm sorry. I'm jumping.
Because we do have questions, but that is a good question.
All right, I'll belt up, but I'll just say that no, actually, this book I really felt almost really an urgent impulse to publish, and I don't want to get too maudlin, but I write about in the acknowledgments about how we had 2 kids in the course of writing this book. And I realized by the end of it, I was writing this book for my kids to try to capture this period in history, which they will never know firsthand. They're too little, but it is in its own way a kind of prehistory of the world they will inhabit. And it felt very, very necessary.
All right, so our first question is from James Lefebvre. He says, "Hi, Evan. Since the country is so divided right now, I'm curious if you found any common political threads among the 3 locations you covered. And as an off-topic aside, have you heard from Chinese artist Ai Weiwei since your New Yorker interview a few years back? If so, how is he doing?"
Yeah.
He currently has a terrific exhibit at the Springfield Museums in Massachusetts.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for both of those. Yeah, on Ai Weiwei, actually, I just was in touch with him just a few weeks ago. In fact, he has a glorious book coming out, which I read in manuscript. And if you're interested in Ai Weiwei and in China and human rights and art, it's just an amazing document. And so that's thrilling. And the unifying thread that runs through all 3 places that I found kind of staggering, the fact that it actually is in all 3 places, Chicago, Clarksburg, and Greenwich, is this belief in this underlying narrative we tell ourselves about the country as a place where you actually can transport yourself from one life to another. Now, I need to say something very clear, which is that when you're in the South Side of Chicago and you're in Auburn Gresham and you're with a family like the family I spent a lot of time with in this book, the Clark family, Maurice Clark in particular, his life has been bounded by these factors way beyond his control. And they're just maddening, actually, in how confining they are and how much they have prevented him from being able to sort of fully experience any prospect of social mobility. And the amazing thing about him is that he does not relinquish the right, the sort of belief in the possibility that he will be able to catapult himself from one life into another. And there is this, it is a strangely American characteristic. And I find that kind of astonishing because the statistics are brutal. The reality of his life is brutal, and in the way that it prevents him from being able to, I mean, for people who will read the book, he is somebody who spent a decade in prison, and his life has been governed by that fact ever since because of institutional failures to allow him the luxuries of redemption. And in a way, yet he believes in the possibility that that things may be better around the next turn. And that is, it almost kind of makes me, it reminds me not to relinquish that idea, because if he holds on to it, then I sure as hell have to.
We have another question from Sam, who says, "Hi, Evan. What were some of the surprises you encountered as you were researching this book?" And hi, Susan.
Your fans are everywhere, Susan. I think, gosh, I had so many surprises. I mean, the way that I write is I'm constantly staggered by the bandwidth of reality. I mean, before we got on the call tonight, we were talking about fiction and nonfiction. And part of the reason I write nonfiction is that I am continually astonished that things are actually as baroque and surprising as they can be. And I guess to give one example, I mean, to give you sort of one concrete illustration of this is, I tell the story of a man named Sidney Mueller in here. And I'm not going to tell his whole story other than to say he's a young man who was a Marine from Clarksburg, West Virginia. And he went off to Iraq and Afghanistan. And his life took a terrible turn. And there is a way of almost kind of impossible coincidences that if you put it on screen, somebody would say, sorry, that's too convenient. And yet that's how actually his world has unfolded. And he's in prison now because he committed a terrible crime. But it's a crime that, frankly, I think all of us should read about. I wanted to write about it because it was kind of lost in the wave of information that we read about the effect of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on the home front. And I decided, no, if you go and you drill down on one case, one example, it sort of satisfies, I think it was Faulkner's line that don't tell me about the life of man, tell me about the life of a man. And I found that very persuasive as I tried to make sense of this kind of tidal wave of effect on American life.
I'm going to ask another host privilege question and wondering your thoughts on social media and its contributions to America's fury.
Yeah. Oh man.
Is it addressed in the book, or is it?
I mean, it's funny. I sort of made a choice. I wrote a profile of Mark Zuckerberg in the New Yorker, which I assumed when I embarked on it would be part of the process of thinking about that very question. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I decided not to do it, partly because I don't feel a claim to the world I don't feel attached to the world of Silicon Valley in the way that these three other places have some place in my soul. And I didn't think I could do something that was going to be original, but I would be curious for Susan's view on this. I don't think you can understand American political culture now without the role of technology. And I think in so many ways it's disastrous. That's not a radical thing to say. And at the same time, I find myself totally addicted to it. And I use it as a political writer. I am on there way more than I want to be. And, but any reasonable accounting of the role that social media has played in our politics is not a happy measurement, I'm afraid.
Susan, did you want to add to that as a merry user of the social medias?
I should probably apologize in advance for whatever tweets I'm going to send later tonight. I agree. As Evan said, all technology is introduced and it's going to be, a global village. We're all going to sit around and talk about things and learn about things that we don't know. And that does happen. But also to Evan's point, we're still very isolated. And I don't think Twitter has helped in the least. I use it as a journalist for breaking news. It breaks on Twitter and then, 3 days later it's on Facebook. But speaking as a practitioner and part of the sewer,
Mm.
I can't say, oh, I've really gotten a lot out of that. It's, well, I really called that person a name. Aren't I awesome? And you know, when you have a president who's announcing policy change on Twitter, we have a problem.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm a sinner and a participant.
You know, one thing that I'm struck by too, though, as I think about, I'm exactly as you say, I love that. I am a sinner and a participant as well when it comes to Twitter. And I'm also struck by how ephemeral this stuff is. I mean, you know, that right now we focus on one technology over another, and these things will be replaced. There will be something else and something else and something else. And part of the lesson for me has been, let's not learn the same lesson over again. Let's actually try to figure out what it is we got wrong on the first generation of social media. And one lesson that comes through in the book very clearly is the idea that tools themselves matter, that it's not just, because oftentimes what you'll hear about social media is, well, it's just a reflection of us. It's no different than pamphlets in the 19th century. And I say, no, except that the pamphlet didn't immediately go to everybody across the country in instantaneous form, and so on and so on. So the tools matter, and the way that we actually do create these instruments have an impact on the effect, not just of degree, but a difference of kind. So I think that's one of the lessons that I take away that applies to technology, finance, politics, all the rest.
Great. I think we're at time. I want to, again, urge people to use the link in the chat to get their, not just get a copy of Wildland, The Making of America's Fury, but get a copy that is signed by Evan. And also know that you are helping support the Mark Twain House and Museum. Just real quick, next Tuesday evening is our first live in-person author event in a year and a half at the museum. We're really excited to be welcoming Nathaniel Philbrick, the historian and author who you may know from Mayflower and In the Heart of the Sea. He's going to be talking about his new book, following in the footsteps of George Washington, called Travels with George. And you can get more information and tickets for that at marktwainhouse.org/events, with maybe an extra /. So thank you so much to Evan, and thank you so much to our dear friend Susan. I never say nice things about Susan, so you know that I think she did an exceptional job tonight. But thank you both, and thank you everyone for tuning in tonight.
Good night.